Hello there, my friends. Let's talk about Israelism. I know you haven't heard of this term, but let me explain. Israelism is more than a lobby. It's a Western cult, and most Western citizens are zombie members of this cult. Let's talk about this. The rogue nature of the Zionist occupying regime has indeed stunned the world. Global bodies, traditionally relied upon to supposedly regulate and punish rogue behavior by the state or by state actors, have exposed their bias and their ineptitude. The desperation of people who retain their faith in the West has led those people to shift their hopes rather innocently to the US, to America. And they depend on the US to step in and stop the carnage we witness in Gaza, Palestine. But those harboring these sad and misplaced hopes in the US have found the US state and bureaucracy to be firmly and irretrievably dedicated to Israel. And that is very clear with every day that goes by. The US is simply unwilling and unable to stand up to Israel. So in the face of this most callous and barbaric act of criminality by Israel in Gaza, the world witnesses the total devotion of the US and its state apparatus to Israel. What makes it worse is that there seems to be little or no pushback from 90% of the citizens of the US. Not too many people seem to be truly outraged by the rank immorality of the regime's defense of genocide. So this forces the question of this video: how can this be happening? How can the once what we thought of enlightened America, how could they have become so ensnared in the Zionist narrative, in this Israel first narrative, which I refer to as Israelism? The answer we are given by enlightened scholars and experts is simply to blame the so-called lobby, in particular the Israeli lobby. I take a different position. I think this is an oversimplification of the problem. After all, if it was a matter of merely paying off and bribing politicians, then rich, billionaire Arabs could do the same, isn't it? Bribery and other inducements do form part of the overall process of enlisting and effecting control. But I believe they form part of a greater scheme, a greater mechanism of control. And that is what I want to talk to you about. Simplifying the obvious control that Israel wields through the Israeli lobby and its instruments such as AIPAC represents an oversimplification of the problem. That's what I believe, and I will show why I think so. The problem is not simply one of material inducements. America's devotion, its dedication to Israel, is far beyond transactional. America's dedication and devotion to Israel is in fact self-sacrificial. And there are many cases that one can point out to, like the USS Liberty in the 1960s, sunk by Israel, like Israel's obvious other areas of like spying on the US, and the US, not really acting with any real punitive response against Israel. Clear signs are there that there is an air of sort of immunity for Israel within the United States, and therefore a sense of self-sacrifice within America. And there is an air of redemptiveness in America's devotion to Israel. I mean, one can't help but sensing it when we look at the relationship between the two. It's the type of self-sacrifice we only see in the realm of cults and religions, in fact. And that is why I'm going to analyze what is obviously a form of religious devotion to Israel from the perspective of the cult and from the perspective of religious delusion. So I'm going to use that perspective to look at this control that Israel wields over America. Now, the dedication to Israelism surely does have elements of material inducement. I agree. It forms part of the greater scheme of control. We do know for sure that lack of devotion by any person of reasonable public influence and stature comes with immediate damning repercussions to him or herself. So we know that, and we see it all the time. What I will show later on is that AIPAC and Israel are the enforcers that bring this damnation on the heretics. You see, the high priests, so to say, of the cult of Israelism. So Israel has moved itself into that position in AIPAC as the high judges, the high priests of the cult. And the damnation follows anyone, and it counts equally to heretics on the political left or right. And there are plenty of examples of such cancelled individuals going back many decades, and you are well aware of them. They even include presidents, by the way. I mean, like Jimmy Carter was effectively cancelled as a man of any effect in America after he took a slightly modestly critical stance against the cult. So let us pursue this idea that the entirety of the US and its vassals, Britain and the European Union, have become psychologically sucked into a cult of Israelism. And most of their citizens with this have become zombie slaves within this cult. Let us just explore this. It is a fact that many great empires, as well as some recent aspiring empires like Nazi Germany, ended up immersed in a cultist delusion. We know that if you study history. This is true. It goes back as far as the Egyptian Empire, and it certainly holds for the Roman Empire. And then most recently, we know that Nazi Germany embraced the cult of the Herrenvolk. It was built on the idea spouted by earlier European colonizers. The Germans just put the cult of the white man's burden on steroids. And this white man's burden cult was something that worked very well for Britain's program of colonization of the rest of the world. And it even, with the white man's burden and the format in which Germany adopted it as the Herrenvolk and the supremacy of the white man, it went on steroids when it was dipped in a veneer of scientism, incorporating the ideas of social evolution, the Ubermensch, and eugenics. So let us see what is the nature of the American and the Western cult of Israelism. My submission is that the Israelism that we see represents a cultural convergence between Jewish chosenness and white supremacy. That is my submission. It therefore represents a type of a syncretic religion or religious cult. A cult that emerged out of two recent bogus Western philosophical and religious discourses. That is what I believe. I believe Israelism is a merging of two bogus discourses. And what are these two bogus discourses? The first of these is white supremacy, which is a psychological vestige of the West's violent rampage into the rest of the world. White supremacy finds its logic in the civilizing mission of the Christian white man and the backwardness, the helplessness, and the hopelessness of the darker non-Christian races. So we all know what white racism is, or white supremacy is, and I'm not going to say more about that. But it's the second narrative, the second false narrative that is more important and that feeds into the modern cult of Israelism. And that second narrative is the cult of exaggerated Jewish victimhood, which is coupled or has as a consequence white guilt. So the second false narrative is exaggerated Jewish victimhood coupled with white guilt. The cult of Jewish victimhood and white guilt is born and emerges out of the concentration camps of 1940s Germany. It represents a redemptive response to the white man's assumed guilt for the ultimate crime of the Nazi Holocaust. Jewish exaggerated victimhood and white guilt, together, they offer redemption to the perpetrators. So it's a cult of redemption, right? The white man's redemption, redeeming the white man of his guilt is really the core aspect of this cult. It also has the effect of elevating the victim in the story, in the narrative, which is the victims of the Holocaust, but also by extension the families of the victims, the descendants of the victims, the second, third, fourth generation descendants of the victims. It elevates those victims, who are obviously not victims anymore, to the status of the conscience of the Western world. And that is the important aspect here, is that the supposed Jewish victims of Western or German or European genocide, Holocaust, whatever, have moved themselves into a position where guilt is assigned and judgment is reserved by one of the parties. And then those who don this mantlehood of Jewish victimhood represent the supreme moral power of the I told you so. The power of I told you so. So essentially this morphs into a sort of a biblical moral position of supremacy that you see in the ancient biblical prophets. But it's important to realize how the painful and tragic memory of two world wars, the absolute carnage, the mayhem, the destruction, the loss of life, tens of millions of lives lost in the Western world. How such a memory could be harnessed, could be employed to project and reinforce the narrative of the chosen people, the rejection of the chosen people, the destruction of God's chosen people, the assigned guilt, the power of this assigned guilt. And so we find within the memory of the memory of the world wars, we find white guilt, white redemption, Jewish supremacy being reinforced and being justified. So Jewish victimhood has been effectively adopted by other interest groups, in fact, in recent decades. The aim is the same, morally encumbering the white man with redemptive sacrifice. And so you have the identitarian victims of the past decade or two, of various forms. And so I'm just mentioning that to say that it is a gift that keeps on giving, the victim narrative. So these two narratives, white supremacy and white guilt, are essentially what syncretized the cult of Israelism. And you can see how powerful psychologically and socially the foundational underpinnings of Israelism therefore are. To close off, I want to explore the idea of it being a cult and look at some of the features or some of the conditions that make cults work or make cults thrive. Now, a cult thrives under three conditions, namely, number one, a working system of inducement of the cult members or the zombies. Number two, ongoing enforcement of the false narrative. And number three, effectively blocking out reality to the zombie cult members. And all of these are present if we look at the US and its vassals today. Firstly, there are inducements that take the form of coercive controls and rewards. The obedient adherent, the cult members, or the cult member is allowed to have a life, to have a career, to have a livelihood, to have a job in an economic superstructure dominated by Zionist control. And this is where the extreme power of Zionism, going back to the entry into the global financial system, is very, very important. The role of money, the role of material inducements, the role of currency, the power of currencies. And this is also where the coercion of bodies like AIPAC comes in. This involves acts of assault, threats, humiliation, intimidation, and other forms of abuse to manipulate and frighten the followers or the members of the cult into conformity. And we all know about cancel culture. So we come to the second condition that allows a cult to survive or to thrive, and it guarantees the survival of the cult. And that is constantly enforcing and reinforcing the false narrative. The narrative of victimhood, of the Holocaust, of other forms of victimhood, and the constant enforcing of the guilt of the West, the white guilt, and by implication anyone that is in any way critical or questions the exaggerated victimhood, Jewish victimhood. And the captured Western media and the Western university are essentially the locus points of this control. The Western university and the Western media. Well, we can extend it into Western cultures and including Hollywood, but these would be the essential locus points where the narrative is enforced. And so that is why it would be very difficult to challenge the university's control over the narrative, the Israeli narrative. And it might be accomplished at lesser universities, but the top universities of each of Western countries, it will be very tough to change the narrative at those universities, which explains in South Africa, where I am from, where the top university at UCT has never been able to arrive at any form of sanction against Israel, because it is in the throngs of Zionist control. So Zionist cultural, political, and financial hegemony is very essential to enforcing the narrative. We come to the third and final condition that makes the survival or thriving of the cult possible. And that is the need for zombie members to be insulated from reality or from truth, from any sort of meaningful truth narrative. So that is accomplished essentially by censorship, nothing else, or by ridiculizing or ridiculing those who are presenting a truth narrative, a narrative based in reality and in truth. So any narrative that threatens the adherent, the zombie adherents with truth or with reality has to be challenged and eliminated. And in terms of the ongoing slaughter and genocide in Palestine, this translates into the banning of TikTok, RT of Russian news, Press TV, the news from Iran, and any platform that creates a chance for the truth to reach the Western zombie members of the cult.